The colony floated in silence, a broken shadow of what it once was, its proud towers now reduced to dark ruins that glimmered faintly under the pale starlight. The streets empty and cold, filled only with the faint echoes of a world that had surrendered to despair. Children huddled close to their parents inside ruined shelters, while elders whispered old stories that no one truly believed anymore, for their defenses had fallen, their leaders silenced, and their warriors defeated, and above them. The enemy fleets moved like vultures circling over dying prey, their glowing hulls casting cruel light down on the shattered colony, every movement a reminder of who now controlled the skies. The people waited, but not with hope, for rescue had been promised before and never came. Distress signals had been sent into the void again and again, but the void had remained silent, offering no answer, no mercy, and now the last survivors spoke in quiet voices, admitting what none of them wanted to believe, that hope itself had died. The enemy broadcast their threats across every channel, mocking the weakness of the colony, declaring that resistance had been foolish and that their surrender was meaningless, for mercy would not be given, and as these words spread, despair grew heavier like a weight pressing on every chest, the younger ones shaking with fear while the older ones simply sat in silence, their eyes hollow, for they had seen too much already. The skies above the colony were no longer a place of wonder, but a canvas of darkness filled with the moving silhouettes of hostile warships, each one armed with weapons that could turn entire districts into ash with a single blast, and the people below watched them, powerless, waiting for the inevitable end, their shelters rattling whenever the enemy ships shifted position, their nerves breaking each time a shadow passed too close overhead, but strangely, the enemy did not strike at once. Instead, circling like predators enjoying the suffering of their prey, stretching out the terror as though their pain was entertainment. Inside the central dome, where once the council had gathered to lead with wisdom, only a few broken leaders remained, their voices weak and uncertain, their authority already stripped away, for what guidance could they give when no help was coming, when no plan had survived, when even the strongest warriors had fallen in the last defense of the colony gates. The survivors whispered in fear about the human legends, stories told in half-belief, stories of powerful ships that had once cut through the stars with unmatched fury, ships said to have been silent for years, unseen, perhaps gone forever, and yet, even these whispers faded as the days dragged on with no sign of rescue, for the humans were a story, a myth, not a reality, and despair settled deeper into their hearts. Some stared at the broken horizon, their eyes wet with tears, asking why no one heard their cries, while others closed their eyes, waiting for death, knowing the enemy enjoyed the suffering far more than the killing. For if mercy had been intended, it would have come long ago. The enemy fleets shifted again, beams of light shining down on the ruins like spotlights searching for signs of resistance. Their laughter audible through the comms, sharp and cruel, and those who still lived buried their faces into their hands, wondering how much longer they could endure. The colony's streets had become graves of silence, where shadows moved but no voices rose, where even the children cried quietly, their fear trained by days of terror, their voices stolen by the presence of death above them, and yet the silence was louder than screams, for it carried the weight of despair, a silence that seemed endless, heavy, suffocating, pressing into the hearts of all who remained, until even hope felt like a forgotten word. The once bright city lights had gone dark, the towers that touched the skies now broken into jagged teeth against the stars, and the air itself seemed colder, thinner, as though the world itself no longer wished to fight, but instead surrender to the void that pressed against its walls. Still, deep in their souls, a question burned though none dared to speak it aloud. What could possibly save them now? What force in the stars could stand against such fleets? What voice could rise from the silence? What shadow could move through the void and answer their dying cries? For though their eyes had grown empty and their hearts had grown heavy, some small, fragile part of them still looked to the skies, waiting, trembling, praying that the darkness might yet break. The enemy fleets did not hurry. They circled the colony like hunters playing with wounded prey, their glowing engines painting cruel lines of light across the blackness of space, every movement seen by the terrified eyes below. The survivors, knowing the predators above could end them in a heartbeat, but instead they chose to stretch the suffering, enjoying the fear that spread through every broken street, every ruined home, every silent shelter. And the people huddled in darkness listened to the enemy broadcasts that filled the airwaves with mocking words, voices cold and sharp, promising that their destruction would be complete, their history erased, their children enslaved, their culture nothing more than ash drifting in the void, and the survivors pressed their hands against their ears, some trembling, some weeping, for the words hurt almost more than the silence. In one of the ruined plazas, a mother held her child close as the enemy speakers announced that no one would come to help them, that their allies had abandoned them, that even if they screamed to the heavens would remain deaf, and the child asked in a broken whisper if it was true, if rescue would never come, and the mother tried to answer but her voice cracked, for she no longer believed her own reassurances, her eyes heavy with despair. The invaders walked through the broken streets when they wished, their patrols moving like shadows, tall figures armored and cruel, dragging away anyone they suspected of resistance, taking supplies, destroying what little life remained, and their laughter echoed as they burned small homes for sport, watching the flames rise into the already broken sky, and the survivors hid wherever they could, in cellars, in tunnels, in ruined halls where dust and smoke choked the air. And yet there was no safe place, because the enemy wanted them to feel hunted, wanted them to live in fear before they finally died. In the council chamber, once filled with pride, now broken and dim, the few remaining leaders argued in hushed, hopeless tones, one insisting they must keep trying to send signals, another claiming it was useless, another whispering that surrender might save at least a handful. But even they knew surrender meant nothing, for the enemy had no interest in mercy, only dominance, only destruction, and so their voices faded into silence again, the sound of despair heavier than any battle cry. In the lower tunnels of the colony, where refugees pressed close together in the dark, whispers passed between them, whispers of the humans, stories half-remembered from older times, tales of warships that once screamed through the stars like storms, ships that carried thunder and fire, ships that even the strongest empires feared, and some clung to these stories with trembling hope, while others dismissed them as myths, cruel illusions told to children so they would believe in heroes. But even as the whispers grew, no one truly believed they would ever see such ships again, and the silence of the void outside seemed to mock them, as though it agreed with the enemy's voice. No rescue would come. In one corner of the tunnels, a young technician sat with broken equipment, listening to the static, his eyes hollow yet stubborn, because he believed he had heard something once, a faint beat inside the noise, a pulse not made by enemy signals, something that did not belong to the invaders. But when he spoke of it, others only shook their heads, saying the mind invents sounds when it wants hope too badly, and so he sat alone, ears pressed to the failing comm, heart beating fast with both fear and fragile belief. Above the tunnels, in the open skies, the enemy fleet grew restless, their commanders mocking the colony more openly now, one broadcast declaring that the final strike would come at dawn, that the sun rising over the broken towers would shine on nothing but rubble, that no living soul would be left, and they laughed as they said it, their voices carrying through every broken speaker, every shattered screen, so that no one in the colony could escape the cruel promise, and children buried there, faces against their parents, while the elders sat in silence, their eyes staring at the shadows moving in the sky, waiting for the end, for they had lived long enough to know that words spoken by the enemy always came true. The night felt colder than before, the silence heavier, the stars above looking distant and uncaring, and some began to whisper prayers not for rescue, but for a quick death, for release from the torment that had been stretched too long. And yet, even in this pit of despair, the question lingered in every frightened heart. Why had the enemy waited so long? Why did they circle instead of striking? Why did they taunt instead of destroying? Was it arrogance, or was it fear of something unseen? Some shadow in the void that even they did not dare awaken, and though no one voiced it aloud, the survivors found themselves glancing at the dark horizon of space again and again, as if expecting something to move, as if expecting a miracle to tear through the silence, and the thought, as fragile as a dying flame, refused to die completely. The invaders could mock, they could threaten, they could claim no help was coming, but the survivors still looked upward, still waited, still prayed that the darkness might yet tremble, that the void itself might scream back, for what else was left to cling to when all hope was gone? That I in the deepest corner of the ruined colony, where the walls cracked and dust hung thick in the air, a young alien technician sat with his head bent low over broken wires and battered screens, the glow of his equipment weak, flickering like a dying ember, yet his eyes refused to leave the static-filled display, his ears pressed close to the receiver that hissed and crackled with endless noise. For in that noise he had heard something once, something faint, like a heartbeat buried in the storm, and though others dismissed it as a trick of his tired mind, he clung to it with stubborn hope, his hands trembling as he adjusted knobs and reconnected wires, ignoring the cold around him, ignoring the voices of despair echoing through the tunnels. Outside, the night sky above the colony remained choked with enemy ships, their engines burning bright as they circled endlessly, their commanders growing bolder with each passing hour, their cruel broadcasts filling the air with taunts that mercy would never come, that the colony would fall by dawn. But down in the tunnels, in the silence of his corner, the technician heard it again, faint but clear, a pulse, slow and steady, different from the static, alien to the noise of the invaders, a rhythm that made his heart leap. He froze, listening harder, afraid to even breathe lest the fragile sound vanish, his mind racing as he tried to strengthen the signal, twisting dials until sparks leapt from the old machine, and the others nearby turned to him, some frowning, some curious, asking what he thought he heard, and when he whispered that it was a human signal, their eyes widened in disbelief, some scoffing, others whispering in fear, for the humans were legends, not reality, ghosts of the past whose warships had not been seen for years, whose fury was spoken of only in hushed tales, and yet his voice shook with certainty as he repeated that he heard it, that it was there, weak but real, a sound not made by the enemy. The refugees around him pressed closer, their faces pale but their eyes hungry for anything beyond despair, and when he replayed the faint pulse for them, silence fell over the group, broken only by gasps, for though it was faint, though it was buried in static, it was real, and in that sound was the whisper of possibility. Words spread quickly through the tunnels, carried on hurried whispers, the name of the humans spoken again and again, some voices trembling with hope, others with fear, for the stories of the humans were double-edged. They were saviors to some, destroyers to others, beings whose warships screamed like storms and left only wreckage in their wake, and though the colonists yearned for rescue, some wondered if rescue by humans might come at a cost too great to bear. In the council chamber, broken leaders listened to the report with skepticism, shaking their heads, saying no such ships existed anymore, that it was foolish to cling to myths, that the technician's ears were tricking him, but their voices betrayed unease, for deep in their hearts they, too, had grown up on tales of human fleets, tales that spoke of engines that howled through the void, of weapons that turned night into fire, of enemies shattered before they even understood the battle had begun. Above the colony, the enemy patrols shifted again, their broadcasts mocking the survivors for whispering about ghosts, their spies perhaps hearing the rumors that spread like sparks in the darkness, and the invaders laughed, declaring that no human would come, that the humans were gone, dead, forgotten, and their laughter rang loud, sharp, cutting into the fragile hope that had begun to grow. Yet even as the enemy mocked, the technician sat by his equipment, refusing to let go, his fingers raw from rewiring, his eyes red from sleepless nights, but his heart steady, for each time he listened he caught the pulse again, stronger now, less faint, as though whatever it was moving closer through the void, and every beat carried with it a promise that something was stirring beyond the darkness. The refugees clung to the sound like lifelines, gathering in groups to whisper about what it could mean. Mothers telling their children that the stories might be true, that perhaps the humans had heard them after all, and for the first time in many days, the children's eyes glimmered with something more than fear, though they still trembled, still clung tightly to their parents. The elders spoke in low voices of battles long past, of times when humans had fought not for conquest but for survival, when they had stood against fleets greater than any one world had ever faced, and had not only survived but triumphed, leaving behind a legend that no enemy ever forgot. And in that moment, though despair still pressed heavy, though the enemy still circled above, the silence of the colony no longer felt as final as before, for now within it was a whisper, faint but alive, that perhaps the void itself had answered their cries. The technician leaned closer to his receiver as the night deepened, his breath catching as the pulse suddenly shifted, turning into a rhythm that no longer seemed random, but deliberate, coded, a message hidden in the noise, and his hands shook as he began to write it down, each symbol scratching into the paper like fire, his eyes wide as he realized the meaning, his heart pounding in his chest, and though the words were few, though the message was short, they carried more power than any speech, more hope than any prayer. Hold on. The technician whispered it aloud, his voice breaking, and those gathered around him gasped, some weeping, some falling to their knees, for the words were real, the message was real, the humans had heard, And though the enemy still mocked, though the skies still burned with hostile fleets, the colony stirred with a fragile, desperate flame of hope, for in the endless void, something was moving, and it was moving toward them. The whispers spread like fire in dry grass, moving from one frightened mouth to another, through tunnels, broken halls, and darkened streets, the story twisting as it traveled, but always carrying the same heart, that the humans had heard, that a signal had been answered, that somewhere beyond the enemy fleets something stirred in the void. At first, it was spoken in secret, in corners where children slept and families huddled together. But as more survivors heard the faint recording of the technician's static turn to rhythm, as they heard those two simple words, "Hold on," the whispers grew louder, bolder, until even the enemy patrols in the streets began to notice the way eyes no longer looked only to the ground, the way fear now mingled with something more dangerous, something close to belief. Mothers repeated the words to their children like lullabies, fathers whispered them into the ears of those too broken to rise, and the old who had already surrendered to despair now clutched trembling hands, wondering if they would live long enough to see the sky change again. The enemy mocked them for it. The broadcasts turned sharper, louder, taunting the colonists for believing in fairy tales, voices dripping with scorn as they promised to burn every home, to silence every whisper, to make sure no human ever came, because no human warship had been seen in years, because the humans had vanished into their own wars, into their own silence, and would never return. Yet even as the invaders spoke, their voices betrayed unease, their commands carrying the edge of impatience, as though they too feared that whispers could grow into something more, that belief itself might become dangerous. The invaders ordered their soldiers to patrol harder, to strike anyone caught spreading false hope. But still the whispers would not die. In the tunnels, refugees gathered in circles around the technicians' broken equipment, straining their ears for the pulse, clinging to it as though the sound itself gave them life, some weeping openly, others staring into the dark with wide, hungry eyes. Among them, children asked their parents if the stories were true, if the humans truly came when all seemed lost, and though the parents did not know, they nodded anyway, their voices steady even when their hearts shook, for the spark of hope in their children's faces was worth the lie if it kept despair away for another night. The elders spoke of old wars, of the times when humans had stood like storms against impossible odds, their warships howling through the black, engines roaring like beasts, weapons bright as suns, and as the elders spoke, the people listened, their imaginations painting pictures of salvation, of a ship screaming through the void to break the enemy chains. But in every whisper there was also fear. What if the signal was false, a trap laid by the enemy? What if the humans did come, but their fury destroyed the colony along with the invaders? What if hold on meant nothing at all, just a fragment of a forgotten code drifting endlessly through space, reaching them by chance and not by intent? These questions haunted them, kept them awake in the cold nights, but still they whispered, because even fear was better than despair, and even doubt was better than silence. The technician himself could not rest, his eyes always on the receiver, his hands always busy with wires and dials, chasing the fragile signal that came and went like a ghost, each time growing a little clearer, each time confirming it was real. Above, the enemy fleet circled, but their formation had changed. Their patrols were tighter, their engines hotter, their scans deeper, as if they too sensed something moving beyond the void, something that made them uneasy. In their command ships, officers barked sharper orders. Their voices no longer playful but hard, cold, as though the endless mocking had lost its edge. They announced new threats over the colony channels, promising that dawn would bring total destruction, that no building would stand, no body would remain, that their patience had ended, but in their urgency there was something else, something the survivors could not ignore, a crack in the enemy's certainty. When night fell heavy again, the colony felt different. The silence was not empty anymore, not final, but trembling with whispers that refused to die. Survivors who had once sat staring blankly into the dark now leaned forward, listening, waiting. The children no longer cried as quietly. Instead, they asked questions, endless questions, about what the humans would look like, about how their ships howled, about whether the void itself would roar when they came. The parents hushed them gently, but even their voices shook with something close to belief. The council leaders argued again, some insisting that the whispers would bring only false hope and deeper despair when nothing happened, others saying that if the humans truly were coming, The colony had to endure just a little longer. In the end, they could agree on nothing, so they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. And through it all, above the ruined towers, the stars shone cold and silent, broken only by the shadows of enemy fleets drifting across them, their engines humming like predators circling the last breath of prey. Yet below, the survivors still whispered, still prayed, still clung to the faint signal, for the words had become a chant in their minds, hold on. Some repeated it again and again until the words lost all meaning and became a beat inside their chests, a rhythm that matched the pulse from the void. They did not know when or how or even if the humans would come, but they knew they would cling to those words until the end, because for the first time since the colony had fallen into silence, they did not feel alone. The night was long and heavy, stretching across the broken colony like a shroud, every hour feeling slower than the one before. Yet beneath that silence something had changed, something subtle but undeniable, as if the void itself had begun to breathe differently. The survivors felt it first, not in their ears but in their bones, a faint vibration running through the stone walls of their tunnels. A tremor so soft it could almost be dismissed as imagination, but too steady, too real to ignore. Mothers pressed their children closer when the ground beneath them gave the faintest hum. Fathers froze in the middle of whispered prayers, and the elders looked up with eyes wide and uncertain. For though they had lived long and seen much, they knew this was no trick of their senses. Above, the enemy fleets also felt it. Their patrols began to move with agitation, their sleek ships shifting positions faster than before, their lights flickering across the dark sky like restless predators losing their patience. On the enemy command channel, the survivors could hear clipped voices, sharp and urgent, a far cry from the taunting cruelty of days before, as officers barked orders and technicians scrambled to check their systems. For their scanners had begun to falter, screens glitching with static where clear readings should have been, and some systems refused to respond at all. At first, the enemy dismissed it as a storm in the void, a simple interference, but the survivors knew storms did not come here, not in this part of the galaxy, not with such rhythm, not with such purpose. The young technician, still bent over his battered receiver, felt his heart pound faster with each pulse that broke through the static, for it was stronger now, heavier, filling the air like a drumbeat, and when he looked around at the gathered faces, he saw in their eyes the same thought that struck his own. Something was coming, something vast, and it was not the enemy. In the tunnels, whispers spread again, sharper and faster this time, carried on the trembling voices of those who felt the vibrations in the walls, who heard the glitching echoes in the enemy's commands, who clung to the idea that this could be it, that the void was no longer silent because the humans were moving through it. Yet with hope came fear, for none knew what shape that arrival would take, whether salvation or destruction, whether the howling storm of a human warship would spare them or sweep them away with the enemy in a single stroke. The enemy fleets grew restless. Their lights burned brighter, their ships shifted closer together, formations tightening as their commanders shouted for readiness, for alertness, for silence, but even their soldiers could not hide the unease in their movements. Some ships fired warning blasts into the void, bursts of light that lit the darkness like false dawn, but the shots struck nothing, vanished into emptiness, and the silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing against them, daring them to fire again. The survivors in the tunnels held their breath, listening to the enemy's fear bleed through their transmissions, and though terror still gripped their own hearts, they could not help but feel a fragile spark of triumph, for at last the invaders were no longer laughing. The colony's leaders gathered in the broken council chamber once more, voices trembling as they argued, one claiming this was a trap, that the enemy was staging the signals and vibrations to break their spirit, another insisting no enemy would frighten their own troops to this degree, that only something greater could cause such disruption, and in the end no agreement was reached, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They wanted to believe, they needed to believe, because belief was the only weapon they had left. Outside, in the ruined streets, survivors who had dared not lift their heads now stood beneath the open sky, staring upward at the shadows of the circling fleets, waiting, watching, trembling as the stars seemed to flicker strangely, as though the void itself had begun to ripple. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, a low thrum so deep it was felt more than heard, a vibration that made stones shift and dust fall from the ceilings of the tunnels, a sound that rose through the bones of every survivor until their hearts beat in rhythm with it. The enemy fleets panicked. Their broadcasts erupted with confusion, with commands overlapping, with reports of sensors crashing, of navigation failing, of systems going blind. Lights across their warships flickered, engines flared too hot, some cutting out entirely, their smooth formations breaking into jagged patterns, ships colliding with one another in the dark as their control faltered. To the survivors below, it looked as though the predators above had suddenly lost their grace, stumbling, falling, desperate to hold formation in the face of something unseen. The technician shouted over the noise of his receiver as the signal burst through stronger than ever. No longer a faint pulse but a roaring howl, jagged with interference but alive, so alive, and the words cut through clearer now, no longer just hold on but something more, something fierce, we are coming. The refugees gasped, some falling to their knees, others crying openly, clutching each other as if those words alone could shield them from the enemy's wrath. Hope surged like fire through the colony, fierce and wild, even as fear gnawed at the edges of their hearts. For the promise of arrival meant the void was no longer empty, meant that something vast and powerful was moving closer with every beat of their hearts. Above, the enemy commanders tried to regain control, shouting orders for their fleets to stabilize, for weapons to be armed, for shields to be raised, but their voices cracked with fear, and their soldiers obeyed with trembling hands, their movements clumsy, for they knew as well as the colonists what it meant when the void trembled, when systems failed, when silence broke with a howl, the humans were coming. And as the first glimmers of dawn touched the broken colony below, painting the ruins in pale light, every soul, survivor and invader alike, turned their eyes to the horizon of the stars, waiting, listening, trembling, for the scream that would soon tear through the endless void. The first light of dawn spread weakly across the shattered colony, painting the ruins in pale gold, but the survivors barely noticed, for all eyes were fixed on the heavens above, on the endless black horizon where the enemy fleets still circled. Their sleek ships once seemed invincible, their presence crushing, but now they flickered with unease, their formations broken, their engines unstable, their movements jerky like predators caught in sudden fear. From the tunnels below, from the cracked plazas, from the hollow towers that still stood, every gaze was turned upward, waiting, hearts pounding in rhythm with the deep vibration that shook through stone and steel alike, a sound that grew heavier with each passing moment. It was not thunder, nor storm, nor quake. It was something alive, something vast, moving through the void with purpose, and as the survivors held their breath, they knew without speaking that the legends were true. The enemy commanders shouted across their channels, voices sharp, overlapping in panic, demanding that their fleets hold formation, demanding that weapons be armed, shields raised, every sensor tuned to maximum. Yet the chaos in their tone betrayed them. Their words no longer cruel, no longer mocking, but frantic, desperate. Reports poured in from every direction. Radars blind, targeting systems failing, navigation lost, ships colliding in the dark. A flagship officer's voice broke through, strained and trembling, declaring that something massive was approaching from the void. But no one could lock onto it. No one could see it. No one could name it. Then came silence, a silence deeper than before, pressing against every ear, holding every heart still. And in that silence, the void screamed. It began as a low howl, a vibration so strong it rattled the bones of every survivor and enemy alike, a sound too vast to be confined to ears alone, a roar that shook the very air, building higher and sharper until it seemed the void itself was tearing open. Shadows rippled across the stars, a distortion spreading like a wound in the sky, and then, with a flash like lightning striking from nowhere, the human warship emerged. Its arrival was not quiet, not subtle. It came howling out of the endless void, engines roaring like beasts unleashed, hull glowing with scars from wars fought in places the enemy could not imagine. The ship was enormous, its silhouette blotting out stars, its frame bristling with weapons that gleamed like suns ready to burn, and every survivor below cried out, some with joy, some with fear, for the stories had not done it justice. The enemy fleets recoiled. Ships that had circled like vultures scattered like frightened prey, their formations breaking completely, commanders screaming orders that no one obeyed, panic rippling faster than discipline. Some ships fired blindly into the dark, bursts of energy lighting the sky like fireworks, but the warship did not falter, did not retreat. Its engines thundered, its howl rising louder, shaking the void itself as it advanced. Survivors on the ground clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces, their hearts unable to decide if they were witnessing salvation or the end of all things. To them, the human warship looked like a god of war, a storm given form, a shadow so vast that even the enemy seemed small against it. For a long moment, the warship did nothing but loom, its presence alone enough to freeze the battle. The enemy commanders barked orders for a full assault, voices trembling as they tried to mask their fear, and the first wave of fire lanced out toward the human ship, beams of energy streaking through the void, missiles blazing like stars set free. The survivors below cried out, their fragile hope clashing with terror, for if the warship fell, all would be lost. But the humans had not come to fall. The void erupted as the warship answered, its weapons igniting with a brilliance that split the sky. Cannons roared like thunder, beams tore through the darkness like lightning, and the howl of its engines grew louder, almost alive, as if the ship itself hungered for battle. The enemy's first line of ships shattered under the barrage, their hulls bursting into flame, debris scattering like dying sparks across the void. The colonists watched in awe, unable to tear their eyes away, their despair breaking under the weight of what they saw. Children screamed with joy, elders wept openly, parents lifted their eyes to the sky for the first time in days without fear. The enemy, once so confident, once so merciless, now fled in every direction, their voices broken on the comms, begging for reinforcements, for orders, for anything to stop the storm that had descended upon them. Yet nothing could stop it. The human warship advanced slowly, steadily, weapons flashing in rhythm with its howling engines, each strike ripping another predator from the sky. The survivors below whispered the same words over and over, voices trembling with awe. They came, they came. In the tunnels, the young technician who had first heard the signal pressed his hand against the trembling wall, tears running down his face as he whispered the message again. We are coming. Now, it was no longer a promise. Now, it was reality, painted across the sky in fire and ruin. The void that had seemed endless and empty now burned with life, with power, with fury that belonged only to the humans. And though the battle had just begun, though danger still surrounded them, every soul in the colony felt the same truth, deep in their bones. The tide had turned, and hope had not only returned, it had screamed out of the endless void. The void burned with fire as the human warship advanced, each blast from its cannons splitting the darkness with brutal light, each strike tearing apart another enemy vessel that only hours before had seemed untouchable. The survivors on the ground could not look away, their eyes wide, their breaths caught, for they had lived in despair for so long that the sight of destruction turned against their tormentors felt unreal, like a dream made of thunder and flame. The enemy fleets, once graceful and confident, now scattered in chaos, their formations shattered, their voices on the comms sharp with panic, commanders shouting for control, soldiers crying out in fear, the steady rhythm of dominance replaced by the jagged noise of collapse. The human warship pressed forward with terrifying patience, not rushing, not reckless, but deliberate, each movement a statement, each shot a judgment, as though it carried the weight of something greater than the battle itself. The invaders fired back desperately, beams and missiles flooding the void, but the warship absorbed them, shields flaring like walls of fire, hull shaking yet unbroken. To the colonists watching from the ruins below, it seemed as though the ship itself was alive, its roar growing louder with every strike it endured, its howl rolling through the stars like the voice of vengeance itself. The survivors cried out each time an enemy ship exploded, their fear turning to shouts of awe, children screaming with joy, parents clinging to one another, tears streaming down their faces as they whispered words they never thought they would say again. We are saved. And yet, alongside hope, there was fear, for the warship's fury was immense, its fire consuming everything before it, and the survivors could not tell if they were witnesses to salvation or merely the eye of a greater storm. The enemy's larger ships tried to rally, pulling together in a last desperate attempt to form a wall against the human vessel. Dozens of warships aligned, their weapons charging, their engines burning hot, and for a brief moment the void lit with the glow of their combined might. The enemy commanders broadcast their threats again, their voices hard, demanding surrender from the colony, promising to crush the human intruder, but their tone cracked with strain, their fear bleeding through their words. The colonists trembled, afraid that the humans would be outmatched, afraid that the storm would end before it saved them. Then the human warship howled again, its engines screaming with a pitch that seemed to cut through the void itself, and with that howl, it answered. Its cannons opened fire in a storm of brilliance, beams slicing through the enemy line with impossible precision, missiles streaking like meteors, tearing ships apart before they could even adjust their shields. One by one, the enemy's proud vessels broke, their hulls splitting, their lights fading into drifting debris. Survivors below screamed as if the battle were theirs, each explosion a release of the pain they had carried, each burning wreck a fragment of justice. The technician who had first heard the signal wept openly, his trembling hands pressed against the broken receiver as though it were a sacred relic, his voice breaking as he repeated over and over, "They came, they came." The battle turned from clash to slaughter. The enemy ships, once so mighty, now fell like stones, their screams filling the comms, their pride broken. Some fled, their engines flaring as they vanished into the darkness, but the warship pursued, striking them down even as they tried to escape, its weapons relentless, merciless, as if it would not allow even one to carry the memory of this defeat back to their masters. To the colonists, it was terrifying and beautiful, salvation wrapped in fire, hope delivered with destruction. The sky above them, once filled with shadows of oppression, now burned with the light of vengeance. On the ground, survivors poured into the open streets, no longer hiding, their voices rising together, some in chants, some in cries, some in prayer. They lifted their faces to the burning heavens, their hearts beating in rhythm with the roar of the warship. The elders, who had seen their world fall into ruin, whispered through their tears that the stories had been true all along, that the humans had not abandoned the stars, that they had only been waiting, and now they had returned. Parents pointed to the sky for their children, telling them to remember this moment, to remember the sound of the void screaming with life. Even those who still feared what the humans might bring felt something they had thought forever lost: faith in tomorrow. The enemy was finished. Their fleets broken, their pride shattered, the few ships left retreating blindly, their commanders' voices silent at last, their mockery swallowed by their own terror. The human warship hovered over the ruins of the colony, weapons still glowing, engines still howling low, a presence so vast and terrible that even in victory, the survivors trembled before it. Yet they did not turn away, for they knew this ship had come for them, had heard their cries, had fought for them when no one else had. In its shadow, they found strength, in its howl, they found the echo of hope. And as the fires of the broken enemy fleets drifted across the stars, the survivors whispered to one another, their voices carried through the ruined streets, through the tunnels, through the rubble of their homes. When all hope was lost, they came. The words spread like light through darkness, and for the first time since the siege began, the colony breathed again, not in despair, but in awe of the storm that had answered their prayers. The void slowly fell quiet again, but it was not the silence of despair that had haunted the colony for so long. It was a silence heavy with awe, filled with the fading echoes of fire and thunder. The enemy fleets were gone, their wreckage drifting like broken bones across the stars, their arrogant broadcasts silenced forever. Where once their shadows had blotted out the sky, only fragments remained, glowing faintly as they burned in the upper atmosphere, streaks of light trailing like falling stars. The human warship hovered above the ruined colony, massive and immovable, its engines rumbling low like the growl of some great beast at rest, its weapons still glowing faintly from battle, its scarred hull casting a shadow over the world below. To the survivors, it was a vision from legend, the embodiment of every whispered story, a ship that had screamed out of the endless void when no one else had come, a storm-made steel that had chosen to fight for them. On the ground, survivors poured into the streets, emerging from tunnels, shelters, and shattered homes, their faces lifted toward the heavens, their voices breaking with disbelief and relief. Some fell to their knees, hands raised toward the warship, their tears mixing with ash and dust, while others simply stood in silence, staring, afraid to blink lest the vision disappear. Children pointed with wide eyes, their laughter sharp and pure after so many days of quiet weeping, and the elders, their bodies frail and their spirits once broken, wept openly, whispering words of thanks, not to the enemy, not to any god, but to the humans, to the warship that had answered when no one else dared. The technician who had first heard the signal sat slumped beside his battered receiver, his face streaked with tears and dirt, his hands trembling as he whispered the words again, "We are coming." It no longer felt like a promise but a memory etched into his soul, proof that the impossible had become real. Above them, the warship remained silent. No message, no voice came from its towering frame, only the steady hum of its colossal engines, the sound reverberating across the ruins like a heartbeat. It did not need to speak, for its presence alone was enough, its shadow a shield against the memory of fear. The survivors wondered what beings lived inside it, who had commanded it to come, what eyes watched them from within its steel walls, but no one dared to ask aloud. Some believed the humans had come only to strike fear into their enemies and would vanish again, returning to the void as suddenly as they had emerged. Others believed this was a beginning, that the humans would not leave, that they would stand guard over the colony now, protectors returned from myth. Whatever the truth, all agreed on one thing: the humans were real, and their power was beyond anything the stars had seen in generations. The enemy's silence was telling. No reinforcements came, no counterattack followed. The survivors realized with trembling relief that the invaders had fled, not regrouped, but scattered, their pride shattered, their confidence broken by a single ship. The thought filled them with awe, that the same fleet that had enslaved them, mocked them, crushed their defenses, had been undone in moments by a warship that roared from the void. They spoke of it in hushed voices, calling it a judgment, a reckoning, a scream of vengeance that no tyrant could stand against. Parents told their children to remember this day, to carve it into their hearts, to never forget that when all hope was lost, the humans had answered. In the council chamber, the surviving leaders sat in silence, their arguments gone, their fears drowned by the sight above. For days, they had spoken of surrender, of despair, of endings, but now they could say nothing, for no words could capture what they had witnessed. One leader whispered at last that the humans had not come for reward, nor recognition, but because it was their nature to fight where hope had died, to answer where silence had swallowed voices. Another shook his head, saying no one could know the true reason, that perhaps the humans were beyond reason itself, a force of nature that arrived like storms and vanished just as suddenly. Yet as they looked out from the broken dome, staring up at the massive shadow above, none could deny the truth. They were alive because of the humans. The survivors gathered together that night, lighting fires in the ruined plazas, not to fight the cold, but to celebrate survival, their voices rising together in song, in prayer, in laughter that seemed impossible only hours before. The children danced around the flames, imitating the roar of the warship, their small hands stretched toward the sky, and the adults let them, their hearts swelling with pride and relief, knowing their children would remember hope instead of despair. The elders told stories of the old wars again, but now they spoke with certainty, for the legends were no longer only stories. They had seen them made real. Above it all, the warship drifted silently, watching. To the survivors, its silence was not threatening, but comforting, like the presence of a guardian who needed no words. Its howl still echoed in their hearts, a sound they would never forget, a sound that would become the foundation of a new story, a story to be told for generations. They knew the enemy would never forget either, that across the stars, whispers would spread of the day an entire fleet was shattered by the scream of a single human warship, of the day despair turned to hope in an instant. And as the fires burned in the colony below, as voices rose in fragile celebration, the warship remained, massive and immovable, its engines humming softly, its presence carved into the sky. For the survivors, its shadow was a promise, that when hope dies, when silence consumes all, when enemies circle like wolves, the humans will come, howling out of the endless void.